All right, what is up? Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's your guy in prayer. We're back, another reacts video. This time we've got Nintendo. We don't want your game. Man invents Pokemon. So what it seems like, the man who invented Pokemon took his idea to Nintendo. They hit him with a big fat no. We don't think that'll do well. We don't think people would be interested. We don't want it. And so he goes out and shoot, we all know what Pokemon is today. I mean, how much is Charizard trading for? Sheesh. Let's not waste any time. Let's go. Hope you guys enjoy. If you do, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button.
Was so obsessed with bugs, he needed to catch them all. He started.
That's how it started?
And it eventually inspired him to create his own universe, Pokemon.
He was a little boy who liked collecting bugs. Okay, I could. That makes sense. That makes sense. I've never even thought about that, actually.
And a mistake caused the franchise to almost never exist. This is the story of how Pokemon was made.
Tell me. I want to know more. Let's go. Let me know what your favorite Pokemon is. Mine's gotta be none other than my legendary Psyduck. I love Psyduck. I don't know why. I don't know what it is. That's my favorite. What's yours? Let me know.
On August 28, 1965, Satoshi Tajiri was born to a Nissan salesman and a housewife in Machida, a rural suburb of Tokyo. As a child, he spent his time hunting and collecting bugs, a hobby that earned him the nickname Dr. Bug from other kids. The nickname wasn't out of place, as Satoshi dreamt about becoming an entomologist. But as time went on, his interests changed, as did the town around him. As the years passed, Machida became more and more urbanized. Trees were cut down, fishing ponds were replaced by arcades, and the bug populations decreased as their habitats were destroyed. When Satoshi was a teenager, his enthusiasm for bug hunting was replaced with enthusiasm for video games. He spent his time at arcades so much so that he cut classes to play games and nearly failed to graduate high school. In fact, he was such a frequent customer that one arcade gave him a Space Invaders machine to take home. His parents worried that he had become a delinquent.
That is actually insane.
Satoshi never attended university, but instead studied electronics for 2 years at a technical school. His obsession with arcade games eventually led him to create Game Freak, a homemade arcade magazine at the age of 17. He would visit arcades for the handwritten and stapled together publication, speak to their owners, and write about tips and cheat codes for arcade games. One of these early issues caught the attention of another key figure in the rise of Pokemon, Ken Sugimori. Ken joined the fan magazine as an artist, contributing his iconic style to Game Freak's illustrations. He and Satoshi quickly became friends, working on the magazine together until wrapping up the magazine 4 years after it began. It wasn't the end for Game Freak though, just a metamorphosis. Ken and Satoshi spent the next 3 years studying programming to chase a dream, and then remade Game Freak. But this time, they weren't just writing about games, they were making them. While the two didn't believe they could make an arcade game, they saw an opportunity in the Nintendo Famicom, which had launched 6 years prior. Their first game, Quinty, was made as a hobby. It was a puzzle game where players flipped tiles to avoid and dispose of enemies while trying to rescue the main character's girlfriend.
Interesting.
Development was unusual. While most game companies made titles using official development kits, Game Freak didn't have access to one. Instead, they hacked their console and learned how to unofficially develop for it. Nintendo wasn't interested in a game by a bunch of hobbyists, so Satoshi began shopping the game around. Namco, a Japanese publishing company, took interest in the title. However, they weren't willing to deal with individuals, leading to Game Freak Incorporating. After breaking into the industry, Game Freak began making games for larger companies. Their next title, Smart Ball, released 2 years later under the Sony banner for the Super Famicom, or Super Nintendo. That same year, they began working with Nintendo directly, releasing the puzzle game Yoshi for the Game Boy. The next few years saw a number of other releases from Game Freak. 2 years after launching Yoshi, they released Mario & Wario for the Super Famicom. They also briefly worked with Nintendo's main rival, Sega, releasing the platforming game Pulseman for the Sega Mega Drive a year later. But all the while, Game Freak had
Some
been
of the
working on a
movement in that
massive
game look
project
kind
that
of cool,
would
actually,
soon
for such an old
overshadow
game.
all the others. By approaching Nintendo back when they first began developing games, Satoshi had opened a door with the video game giant. The following years and Game Freak's later releases on Nintendo consoles only served to strengthen the ties between the two companies and led him to become friends with Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, and Gunpei Yokoi, inventor of the Game Boy. A year after Game Freak had released Quinty, Satoshi had been struck by inspiration. Spotting a pair of Game Boys linked together by a link cable, a device that allowed the handheld consoles to network together, he began imagining insects crawling up and down the wires.
Oh,
Remembering his childhood hunting bugs, Satoshi came up with a game idea where players could explore, collect creatures like the Gashapon capsule toy machines, and trade them with each other. Pitching the game was nerve-wracking though. Satoshi was afraid that the executives at Nintendo wouldn't get the concept, and he had been told that they'd reject it outright. But even with his doubts, he still brought the idea to the house that Mario built.
Which is crazy to think, like,
Just
that's
as he'd fear,
what
when Satoshi
his
first
thoughts
pitched the
were,
idea to Nintendo,
and see what
they
Pokemon
weren't sure
actually
about
turned
the
into.
idea.
It's actually
However,
insane.
the executives relented and gave Game Freak the go-ahead to get working on it. Shigeru Miyamoto not only backed the idea, but he also took Satoshi under his wing and acted as a mentor to the younger game developer. Game Freak had been given the chance to make the game of Satoshi's dreams. Now all they had to do was survive long enough to release it.
That is actually insane.
What are you doing today?
I mean, everybody knows what Pokemon turned into. Me personally, I think the first one I ever played was on the Game Boy Color. It was a purple Game Boy Color. I still remember it. And it was, I want to say yellow. Pokemon Yellow, I believe. Great game. I had to have been like,
Pokemon's development was a troubled one.
I don't know. I
Game
was
Freak almost
small.
went bankrupt during the development cycle, and the company had to take on work for other companies in order to make ends meet. Not making matters any better were the Unix computers that Game Freak were developing the games on. The computers crashed often, and 4 years in, one crashed so badly that the programmers couldn't recover the machine, and that particular machine happened to have all the data for the game, all the Pokemon, and the main character. According to Junichi Masuda, composer and one of 2 programmers for the original Pokemon games, it felt like if they couldn't recover the data from the computer, the game was finished. He had to look up English manuals for the computer in order to get the data back. On top of unreliable machines, Game Freak also lost staff over the course of development, and the staff that did stay had to work without pay due to the financial troubles that Game Freak was facing. But as the years passed, Game Freak saw the light at the end of the tunnel, only for another issue to loom over them, threatening the
maybe it was
success of the
Blue,
project.
the one I had. I don't remember.
Enjoying this story so far? Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get more fascinating stories about today's biggest companies.
We are enjoying the video.
After
Thank
6 years, the Game Boy had lost much of its popularity
I'll
in
have
the
their
Japanese
channel
market.
link down below for you
Others
guys.
in the industry were questioning how good an idea it was to launch Pokemon for the console,
There'll also be a
saying
link
that
to
it
this
wouldn't sell
video
very
if you want to
well.
rewatch it again on your own time.
With release fast approaching, the team began debugging the game, making sure that everything worked properly. After this, the team was instructed to not add anything else. However, the debugging process opened up 300 bytes of space on the game cartridge, just enough to add Pokemon number 151, Mew. Monster designer and programmer Shigeki Morimoto had included Mew as an Easter egg, a secret hidden Pokemon in the game. Originally, he intended to only let developers have the Pokemon unless they could find some kind of post-launch event to include it as. However, due to a glitch, Mew also appeared occasionally in regular games. Then, Pokemon launched as 2 titles, Pokemon Red and Green. For a while, the team was kept in limbo with no indication of how well the games were even selling. So, they traveled out to game stores to see how it was being received. At first, Pokemon launched to only a modest reception, but soon, word of the game spread through word of mouth and sales spiked, partially thanks to rumors
That
of a
is
hidden
insane.
Pokemon in the game. Even before Pokemon spread outside of Japan, it was already becoming a franchise. Later that year, the Pokemon trading card game was released in Japan by Media Factory. The card game had the same addictive collectability to it, containing not only cards of popular Pokemon, but also rare foil versions. It also helped that the game was both fun and competitive. Pokemon wound up selling millions of copies in Japan and then launched in the United States 2 years later as Pokemon Red and Blue. Despite concerns that Game Freak had over whether a turn-based role-playing game would attract an American audience, Pokémania spread to Game Boys nationwide all the same. The trading card game made the jump across the Pacific a few months later, published by Wizards of the Coast, the same company behind another hit card game called Magic the Gathering. The cards exploded in popularity just like they had in Japan. Satoshi didn't realize it, but he hadn't just created a game, he had made a pop culture phenomena. Kids took to it in a frenzy, and some became obsessed with it. What Satoshi also didn't realize was that it would pull
And to
his
think
company
all
to
this
new
time
heights
later-
before dragging it down.
Before dragging it down, what happened? I guess they did have a little fall in popularity there for a little bit, and now they're back again. The world's biggest franchise? Is that like factual? I wonder if that's factual.
Since launching 3 years prior, Pokemon had expanded beyond just a pair of games released for Nintendo's aging Game Boy console. It had become a trading card game, a hit anime, and a line of popular merchandise. Pokemon was more than just a media franchise. It was a way of life. But the series' meteoric rise among children worldwide was brewing up a storm of trouble aimed right back at Satoshi's dream game. Pokemon flu had infected the world, and parents were becoming worried. The sight of children with handfuls of Pokemon cards was becoming commonplace at schools throughout the world, leading to concerns about how the game was impacting children's ability to learn. Those concerns, along with other issues like children without Pokemon cards feeling left out, and children prioritizing the cards over eating lunch, resulted in principals banning the cards from schools outright.
Oh wow.
Some parents feared that the buying and trading of Pokemon cards was similar to gambling. A group of parents in New Jersey even sued Nintendo, believing that the card rarity was like racketeering. It wasn't just the trading cards that caused controversy though. The animated series encountered a number of issues as well. Famously, one episode with flashing red and blue lights caused seizures in 685 children across Japan. Another episode was barred from air on America television due to a character threatening 10-year-old protagonist Ash Ketchum with a firearm. But there was another controversy coming out of America.
Someone called and said, is Pokemon demonic?
The answer to that is yes, they are all Oriental demons.
Just like other pop culture phenomena before it, Pokemon was the subject of its own satanic panic. Fundamentalist Christian groups claimed that Pokemon were demonic in nature and were corrupting the youth. Others took issue with Pokemon evolving into new forms, believing it was a way to teach children Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. But no matter how many controversies struck Pokemon, nothing seemed able to keep its appeal down. When Pokémon, the first movie released a year after the games reached America, it was an instant success and brought in more than $160 million at the box office. The same year, a special edition of the first Pokémon games called Pokémon Yellow was released. It gave the player a Pikachu as their starter Pokémon, just like in the animated series. But it wasn't just expansions on the original game. Pokémon games were spreading far and wide. The same year that Pokémon Yellow released, a game called Pokémon Snap launched on the Nintendo 64. In Snap, instead of catching Pokémon, players captured photos of their favorite Pokemon and got high scores based on posing and shot composition. The next year, a slew of
That one
Pokemon
actually
games was
sounds kinda
unleashed
funny.
on an audience hungry for more. Pokemon Stadium launched in America on the Nintendo 64 and let players use their Pokemon teams from the Game Boy games in 3D. There was also a Pokemon puzzle game, Puzzle League, and a game that came with a microphone to let players speak to their very own Pikachu and go on adventures, Hey You Pikachu. And on the Game Boy Color, there was a video game version of the Pokemon card game and the next generation of Pokemon, Gold and Silver. The new games brought players to a new region with new Pokemon to catch, new gyms to beat, and in a move that caught many by surprise.
I also
Once
did
the
play
main game was
Gold
completed, the region from the
little
original
bit later
Pokemon
down the
games
road.
would be unlocked for players to revisit, along with a hidden encounter with the player character from Red and Blue. The new Pokemon game sold over 20 million copies, and the franchise has only grown since.
I've
That
been
is
getting paid
absolutely
$1,000 a month, if not.
insane. I mean, just to think this long ago, like, I still remember playing these games. Good times, good times.
A year later, Gold and Silver were joined by Pokemon Crystal, which added new legendary Pokemon to the game, and gave players the choice between a boy and girl character. In the following years, Ruby and Sapphire, Fire
I had
Red and
Ruby.
Leaf Green, and Emerald were released for
Then I
the
went
Game
to
Boy
Leaf
Advance.
Green.
Then, Diamond and Pearl, Platinum, Heart Gold, and Soul Silver were released for the Nintendo DS. Afterward, X and Y, Omega Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire were released for the Nintendo 3DS. Of course, there were more titles released every year, side games and side games included, meaning that no fans of the series
Mystery
had to go
Dungeon.
without something new
Those
for
are
long.
good.
New sets were also released for the card game and were being published by Nintendo instead of Wizards of the Coast.
The Red Rescue.
But 2
team, that
years
was the one
after
I
the
had.
Ruby and Sapphire remakes, a new Pokemon game launched that changed everything.
Pokemon
Oh, yeah.
Go.
Pokemon Go.
Pokemon Go.
Pokemon.
Pokemon Go. Go was a phenomenon in its own right and drew players across the world to a game where they could catch Pokemon in the real world. At its creation, Satoshi had envisioned Pokemon as a game where its players could experience the hunt for bugs in the wilderness. Now, they were living it. Within months, Pokemon Go had built up a user base of over 200 million players and had made
Which is
$207
absolutely
million
insane.
in its first month.
Let me know if
alone.
you guys, if you've
Players
made it
of
this
all
far in,
ages
let me
took
know
to
if
the
you've played
outdoors in
Pokemon
order
Go,
to find and
if you
catch
still
their
play
favorite
it till this
Pokemon.
day.
People were obsessed. Until they weren't. As the summer ended, so did Pokemon Go's player base, dropping to under 50 million by the end of the year. One issue that led to Pokemon Go's rapid decline was players being disappointed in a lack of features. At launch, the game had no way to battle other players except for limited gym battles, and the game's developer Niantic was slow to add new features and even remove some popular features from the game. A disastrous Pokemon Go Fest the next year didn't help anything. Hosted in Chicago, the event was meant to be a place for Pokemon Go fanatics to meet and catch legendary Pokemon, but the 20,000 people proved to be too much for the local cell phone networks, and game server crashes left a sour taste in the mouths of many attendees.
Understandably
The
so.
situation grew so poor that the CEO
bar
of
says
Niantic was booed
absolutely.
on stage, with shouts of "Fix the game" coming from the crowd.
Help me welcome to the stage the CEO of Niantic, Mr. John Hankey.
Thanks, Rachel.
But Niantic didn't give
Wow,
up
that
on
was
the
a
Pokemon title,
loud
and over the
boo.
years drew players
was
back to the
absolutely
game by adding in
insane.
much requested features and hosting new events. While they still haven't reached the popularity level they started at, Pokemon Go broke 1 billion in annual revenue 4 years after launch, an over 20% increase compared to its first year. Then, just as COVID began forcing people inside, a new Pokemon phenomena rocked the world. Many who found themselves spending their entire days at home began looking for things to do and turned to Pokemon as a familiar and fun way to pass the time. Among those who turned to the familiar old feeling of Pokemon trading cards were live streamers like Logan Paul, Steve Aoki, and rapper Logic, who all began buying up boxes of booster packs and opening them live with hundreds or thousands of followers watching and sharing in the excitement of getting a rare card. Videos of the streams went on to garner millions of views and further excite fans about picking up the trading card game. With the increased demand for Pokemon cards, prices have increased too. Rare cards like an original basic set Charizard have skyrocketed in price from 16,000 to 300,000.
Absolutely insane.
The surge in prices has been great news for card collectors who are now earning millions off the sales of Pokemon cards, getting rich practically overnight. Of course, the Pokemon video games haven't slowed either. The same year that Pokemon Go took over smartphones worldwide, Pokemon Sun and Moon released, followed by yearly releases of Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, Sword and Shield, expansion packs for Sword and Shield, and remakes of Diamond and Pearl. Since then, the open-world Pokemon Legends Arceus released to popular reviews, and a new series of games, Scarlet and Violet, have been announced. No matter what happens, one thing is for sure: Pokemon is here to stay.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
Today, Pokemon is the highest-grossing franchise of all time, surpassing even Star Wars, Marvel, and Mickey Mouse as it brings in $100 billion in sales. As for Satoshi, he continued to be heavily involved with the direction of the franchise and is widely known as one of the top game creators in the world. This is the story of how a bug-obsessed kid who spent his high school days skipping class to play games in his local arcade created a game that changed the world. For more interesting stories about today's biggest brands,
that's crazy. Congrats to him though. Like, he had a dream, he stuck to it through everything, and just didn't give up and made his dream a reality. Alright, well, that is all for that one. I'm out of here. You guys have a wonderful time, and I will see you in the next one. So until then, I'm out. Peace.